Hi, Dave.
Hello, Arthur. How are you?
Very well. Excited.
I'm hugely excited, and I hope everybody else who has joined us is as excited as we are. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Liquid Antiquarian with Arthur Motley and myself, Dave Broom. I'm sure most of you have watched before, but there's always going to be newcomers, and it's good. So just to give you a quick précis of who we are, we're not historians. We are not archivists, although Arthur attempted to become one last week. We are, in fact, keen antiquarians. We love nothing more than delving into dusty drawers and seeing what comes up. Primary sources are important. Thank you to all of you who have joined up on Patreon to support us. That is absolutely magnificent. We really, really greatly appreciate it. And it's wonderful to see the community. Can I use the word community? Yes.
We can now.
We can now.
Scale now.
I've used it twice. The community, 3 times, growing. This is great. It allows us to invest more money in strange objects and do more research. We will not be using all of your money to invest in casks. Arthur, what's in your glass tonight that is going to be appropriate for the evening?
It is a glass of Geneva, Dutch Geneva.
Well, I too am having a glass of Dutch Geneva, 10-year-old Geneva from my dear friend Patrick Zedam. And the reason for us drinking Geneva will, I think, become apparent relatively soon. But let us raise a toast before we go any further. I've promised of a belter here. A toast to all our Patreon supporters and to all the newcomers who have joined just in the past week. Slàinte.
Slàinte. Cheers to you guys. And that's a Dutch sailor drinking a or is it a German blended rum? I can't remember. But we'll feature a different fun character from the past whenever we toast our Patreons, because it is heartily appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely, greatly. Yeah. So this is part 2. I like the fact we're doing a 2-parter. This is wonderful. So this is part 2. For those of you who were around last week and watching our return, we had a look about when Scotch whisky began to be deliberately, i.e. consciously matured, not just put in a cask to be transported or just stored, but actually consciously put in the cask because of the knowledge that doing so would improve the quality and the flavour and get rid of the goo, which is a term that actually seems to cause us more questions than anything last week, and we will return to the goo later on. All the books say essentially modern Scotch whisky, or whisky as we understand it now, started post the 1823 Excise Act. We kind of disagreed with that. We like kind of exploding myths. And I think in the research that we did last week, it showed that date can be pushed back by almost 100 years. This is part 2 of the birth, the true birth of Scotch whisky. So what is our big question today, Arthur?
Very simply, it is, how did the Scots get so good at distilling malt spirits?
Roll credits. Never fails to get me, my toes tapping. Right, okay, let's get started on this. So I want to kind of start, I think, by defining what we mean by birth. You know, we're not talking about, you know, the absolute origins of the distillation of a malt spirit in Scotland, which, you know, essentially is that ridiculous myth about it being monks, etc. that might be something we go to in another episode. But the start date of what you could call as kind of whiskey proper, i.e. a spirit made in ways that we could recognize today. So we looked at maturation, that conscious maturation of improving quality. What about distillation? When did this idea of quality distillation and understandable to a modern audience really start? Again, there seems to be this idea, when you looked at the kind of authorized version of Scotch whisky history, that this is going to be triggered by the 1823 Excise Act, which undoubtedly was when kind of the proper commercial modern Scotch whisky industry began. But the idea that 1823 was actually the start of quality distillation in Scotch, we think simply isn't true. And Arthur, I seem to believe that you're coming dangerously close to saying that the Dutch invented Scotch whisky.
It's a really good headline. It's not a headline that I'm going to use. It's tempting to call the episode that for the clicks, but I couldn't bring myself to do that because I don't think either of us believes that people really invent a drink, except in myth. Dom Perignon, I was doing a champagne tasting last night. Dom Perignon invented champagne. That's a myth. Drinks develop, and people and groups of people have more significant contributions to accelerate progress, if you want to call it that, towards a modern drink. And really the argument of today's episode is going to be that although they do get referenced, the Dutch, they have a far more significant role in whiskey's history than is given credit for. Moving it from this situation in the 17th century and early 18th century where stuff was distilled from grain, undoubtedly in Scotland. But during this 18th century, in the first half of the 18th century period, we're going to show some really compelling evidence, some that has been referred to, some that hasn't. I think really importantly, it's the links that we're going to make that are going to create a really exciting through line, a really exciting narrative that shows the Dutch were central to helping the Scots distill malt spirit very, very well.
I think that's very fair. I'm looking forward to this. And I like this idea of the cross fertilization. We touched on it last week, where this idea that you had rum, you had cognac, you had Geneva, all being deliberately aged, and all of them being imported into Scotland, having been deliberately aged. But all the Scots distillers were kind of sitting there going, "Oh, that's a ridiculous thing. We would never do such a ludicrous idea." There was an incredible amount of cross-fertilization and exchange of ideas and expertise and knowledge all the way through the 17th, all the way through the 18th century. So, this idea that Scotch was kind of sitting there, over there on its hill, as people often tend to think of it, sitting up there, above everything else, simply isn't true.
I'm just keeping an eye on a few of the comments. Because the Dutch taught them, says multi-mission, and then Tim, our friend Tim, inspired is maybe a better word for it. Great comments. I think we're going at this a little harder, and we're talking about specific people, and we're showing some great evidence. So strap in. It's going to be really, really exciting. Actually, on the comments, I should say, it's going to be quite a busy night. Dave, you supported me in this research for this, but I've done a lot of the work behind this. Yeah. So I'm going to be presenting and clicking buttons. So normally I keep an eye on the comments. I can't. We should say that through Patreon, we've now got that medium to actually run through past comments from this episode and the previous episode. We're storing them up, and we may have a question and answer session on Patreon afterwards, after this bombshell drops. Okay, dropping bombs. So from the top, I wanted to just show you some of the references. That's a good way to talk about, well, introduce who we're talking about. And principally, this is two individuals, Dr. Hermann Boerhaave and Henricus van Wyngarden. So these are the principal sources we're going to run through. The second one, Henricus van Wyngarden, has absolutely been referred to in whiskey literature, but as a bit of a byline. I have delved as far in as I can to this chap. We're going to give a little bit more colour to him, but he has been given credit for influencing the Scotch whisky industry and the birth of it. The earlier one is Hermann Boerhaave. Now, he is an extremely significant person in the history of science. His dates were 1668 to 1738. He taught at Leiden University, and he is known as the father of chemistry. It is said that he wrote arguably the first chemistry textbook. This is an extremely significant man in the history of science. And what we're going to do is we're going to show his process for distilling, and we're going to track how that is shared within Scotland. We're then going to discuss about our friends, the improvers, and then Van Wyngarden is going to come in. So I thought it would be useful to give that kind of through line of the sources and the timeline that we're talking about. This is Boerhaave. And in his, that first reference, Elementa Chemiae, I don't speak Latin, apologies, to anyone that does. He does a lot of work on distillation. And I guess from a scientific standpoint. So the influence on science is going to be a theme that is going to run through this very much so. Before I get into this, Dave, what's the accepted story? Have we covered that yet? How did, what are we saying in terms of how Scotland learned to distill malt spirits? If you're going to summarize in a few sentences, what is most often summarized in books?
What is most often summarized in books is that the knowledge of distillation arrived in Scotland in the cassocks of monks and was then held hermetically behind the walls of monasteries, where distillation was used primarily, for medicinal purposes. That bit's correct. But then, round about the Reformation, Henry VIII and the dissolution of monasteries, etc., the monastery walls fell down, and suddenly everybody was able to suddenly realize what this incredible technique of distillation was all about. And again, the books kind of suggest that it immediately fled out into the countryside, immediately fled out, particularly into the Highlands, and there it kind of sat as being the local rural spirit, while the rest of Scotland drank imported goods. And it was really only after the Enlightenment, tail end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, that you begin to see Scotland beginning to take whisky seriously in terms of drinking it and also in terms of production.
Brilliant summary. Thanks, Dave, because I think it's important to show how what we're about to discuss is a slightly different tale. So, Dr. Boerhaave, as I say, highly significant man in the history of science, and in his most important text, for some reason, I can't find in any whiskey books his discussions of alcohol. I must admit I hadn't even heard of him before I started researching this episode. So there's lots in there. We love these little descriptions of the effects of alcohol. Let's warm up with that. Dave, give us your jolly, ever more inebriated voice.
In the first place, it is capable of producing a disorder in the function of the animal spirits and powers. And it generally brings about in the following manner. First, it refreshes, exhilarates, raises his spirits, makes a man merry, and disposes him for the gayer diversions of singing, dancing, and the like. It then affects his proper and prevailing passions, discovers him particularly, and makes him speak his mind freely. Afterwards, it disorders both his internal and external senses, and disturbs, weakens, and at last takes away his voluntary motion, so that neither the foot, hand, nor tongue can perform their office. And then follow sleep, palsies, apoplexy, and often death itself. This now.
That'll do. That'll do.
Yeah, there we go. But responsible drinking, essentially, that's what Boerhaave is saying. It's fine loosening the tongue, but after you keep going, death.
But he does a lot of work, and he explains a distillation method. And we'll go into this part in a little bit more detail, and then later on we will track the influence of Boerhaave in Scotland. So in this, they talk about this concern of preventing an impruma. I'm going with, I can never say that word, with a few techniques. Rubbing the bottoms and sides of the still with some oily matter, stirring it as you heat it to prevent this sticking to the bottom. There's a part about putting some boiling water in there as well to help mix the fermented liquor that you are burning, you are boiling effectively to stop it burning. And what's this next part? The whole fermented butter. Yeah, they're saying give it a mixing effectively before it goes into the still. And then point 28, they're basically talking about be careful how you distill. Make sure you leave 1/3 of the still empty, and manage that fire so you're controlling the heat and the drops fall presently one after the other, and then you can safely perform distillation. So a pretty sensible way to distill, a pretty recognizable one, to how we would distill malt whiskey now, albeit on a much smaller scale, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You speak to any distiller and they go, oh yeah, we distill very slowly. And I'm thinking back to the great James E.D. book that came out last year, about 1927, distillation practices. And, the quotes about, the speed and the rate of distillation and how to measure it. And, the stream of alcohol should be the width of a turkey quill. And it's essentially that. You talk about headspace. You're talking about not having carryover. If you overfill your still, especially with your beer, you boil it up too hard, you're going to get carryover. You're going to get that emphromatic character. Your hogo begins to emerge. So here's real, understandable. You look at that and you compare that to how we make whiskey in the 21st century, and you go, yes, the same principles are being applied.
He also suggests cutting the spirit as well. So I've underlined the part about sea salt, putting that in as well. That's not uncommon in the Dutch method. It pops up from here and there. But then he says, I then begin the distillation. He is actually doing this. And the first 2 ounces of alcohol that come off, I keep by themselves. And of the remaining alcohol, then the first 2/3 I receive into a very clean, dry glass vessel and keep by itself in a bottle as nicely stopped as possible. So heads, hearts, and tails. Yep. Recognizable. We go to move on to actually showing and providing evidence of how it is Boerhaave's recipe that is used in Scotland. How that is used, by whom, and what their motivation is. And it's a political and economic motivation also that's quite different to that narrative of whiskey that's most often said. But I think, Dave, you were surprised to find this link to Hermann
Yes,
Boerhaave.
I was. I'd never actually come across this man. To my shame. Given how important he is in the world of medicine, the world of chemistry. And it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing to see that. And I think also the personal tone of it. He's not just. This is a man who appears to have really gone in and actually done it. This is a practical explanation of what distilling practice is. So. Yeah, I think it's a really, really important text.
But when I remember the first time we spoke about it, and I said, I've got this link to Boerhaave. It was a surprise, but then not a surprise at all.
Yeah.
And both of us were saying, and especially you actually, who has a broader knowledge of other spirits and the history of other spirits, well, this makes so much sense. It was almost just whiskey that was left. But we'll come on to the Dutch influence on other spirits as well. But first, it also makes sense for the cultural, the economic, and the educational exchange that was happening between Scotland and the Netherlands over a very long time. We might see that in places in Scotland and places in the Netherlands. So Currus in Fife is a lovely little place in Fife that some people might know. Those tiles are known as Dutch pan tiles, and apparently they came over as ballast in ships for probably wool that was being traded over there, and they would come back, and then we started making these tiles themselves over there. There's strong links over there. And then there's this Scottish town of Vierda, in, I forget which part of Netherlands it is, but this was effectively what was called a staple port. So all Scotch goods had to go in there. And it was operational as a place where approximately 10% of the population was actually Scottish living there at any one point. And they had special privileges. They could have their own church. I think the town actually put up each merchant for 3 days free of charge, with food and booze included. And there are buildings that mark the presence of the Scots that were there, the Scotshuizen. So this is going back well before Boerhaave. Obviously, that's got a sheep on there, reflective of that wool trade. And that's where these Scotch merchants would stay and live and have their own mini society within that society. There's another picture of a Scotshuizen. And also there are military links as well, the Scots Brigade. So sometimes called the Anglo-Dutch Brigade or the Anglo-Scots Brigade, which was an infantry brigade in the Dutch States Army, formed back in 1586, and had, I think, 5 or 6 infantry regiments, 3 from Scotland, 3 from England, dissolved in 1782 after the Anglo-Dutch War, one of the Anglo-Dutch wars. There were a few, and sport and art. So possibly, not only did the Dutch invent Scotch whisky, not really, they also invented golf. Or it is, some people who know more about the history of the sport have said that this 13th century depiction of golf, which is Dutch, bears some resemblance to golf. It's also looks a bit more violent than golf, judging by the guy on the right.
Yeah, it does actually. It looks more like shinty or something.
Yeah.
But anyway.
And then on the right, we've got one of the most famous Scottish paintings, Rayburn, the skating minister it's referred to. I think that's the chap in there is Thomas Walker. He learnt to skate on the canals, it is believed, of Rotterdam, I think it is. And those skates are apparently Dutch style skates. So we have these long and deep economic and cultural lines of exchange between the two countries immediately before the flowering of malt whiskey production. But most of all, we have educational links. And Dr. Boerhaave was a professor at the University of Leiden, an ancient and highly respected university. And the importance of Leiden to the Scottish Enlightenment and the thinkers in the Dutch universities to the Scottish Enlightenment are enormous. So we've got chaps like Alexander Monroe and John Rutherford. So John Rutherford was one of the founding professors of the Edinburgh Medical School, and the 4 other founding professors also studied in Leiden. Alexander Monroe, I think he was the first professor of pathology, possibly. He also studied in Leiden. And Leiden was a real destination for the Scots particularly. And to go over and study, maybe not to do full degrees, but a full 2-3 years there. But they would go over there for 6 months, for a year. Relatively well-off young gentlemen would go over there from Scotland, and hundreds would be there at a time. And they would have something akin to an educational gap year or exchange year, and they would collectively book lectures with people like Boerhaave on medicine and philosophy, but also shooting and riding horses. And there's lots of accounts of all these chaps over there having a great time. But even there was one account that I heard about where the young Scots guy was saying, actually, it's a bit disappointing because everyone here is Scottish. which reminded me of those gap year travelers who try and go to the ends of the earth to find this remote place to get a different experience. And they find everyone.
I'd be like St Andrews University, everybody's American or English.
Yeah, exactly. So you end up in Koh Samui and everyone's from Islington. Yeah. So Boerhaave's book is 1732. That we're referring to, but he was lecturing and he was talking about these things much earlier also. He didn't actually visit Edinburgh, but a lot of people heard from him and were taught by him, who then went back to Edinburgh and founded effectively Edinburgh Medical School. And there was also great influence in law, and the Edinburgh Botanic Gardens, I think, was inspired by somewhere from Holland. The links go on and on and on. And I should actually just say a quick thank you to Billy Kay, who wrote that excellent book, Knee Deep in Claret, which we can recommend. This is one of my 3 copies I have of this book.
That's a brilliant book. Brilliant.
Yeah, no, it's a really brilliant, that inspired a lot of people, I think, and is still referred to. And he did a very good documentary for BBC Scotland, the radio, on the links between Scotland and the Netherlands, where he spoke to senior academics, and some of the conclusions were, we cannot imagine the Scottish Enlightenment happening if it hadn't been for the Dutch, or certainly not in the same way. So it makes perfect sense. There's also another nice link to our last episode as well, isn't there, Dave? If people watch the one on maturation, Mr. Archibald Pitcairn.
Yeah, Dr. Archibald Pitcairn. Yeah, that kind of rang a little bell. This is from Dr. E.B., the mysterious E.B. MD, his treatise on the virtues of whiskey, which, if you haven't seen last week's episode, please do, because his treatise is quite extraordinary. Pitcairn, Archibald Pitcairn, 17th century Scottish physician, a poet, Edinburgh-based. He started off in a kind of literary artistic world and then moved to medicine, as one does, continued to practice in Edinburgh till 1681, and then he was appointed Professor of Physic at Leiden in 1692. So he was in charge of the medical facility at Leiden. And who was one of his pupils? Boerhaave. And he also corresponded, Pitcairn also corresponded occasionally with Isaac Newton, whose name will appear in a couple of minutes as well. So an important, really, really, really important figure. And, you know, he then went back to Edinburgh and helped to develop what would become the Edinburgh Medical School, which started in 1726. And I think it's quite interesting kind of looking at the history and the links between the various medical schools. Pardon me. The first one really recognized is Salerno. And that was kind of the 1100s, the 1400s. And then also in Italy, you've got Padua, you've got Bologna, and that's 1500s. And then Paris and Montpellier in the 1600s, plus Leiden begins to come on, then Leiden, and then it moves to Edinburgh. And these are the kind of leading medical schools in Europe. And if you then look at that chain and begin to think about the knowledge and the application and the study of distillation, it starts in Salerno and it continues in Leiden, and it certainly continues in Montpellier, and it continues on into Scotland as well. So you see this kind of medical history of distillation, and this link, it's being a link in this continuum. And I find that particularly fascinating. You know, as soon as I began thinking about that, I was thinking, well, Salerno's part of this, you know. And essentially, if you want to look for a starting point in Europe, it's Salerno. So yeah, I was excited about that. Anyway, Pitcairn, yeah, really, really important. He was an atheist. He's buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh, close to Greyfriars Bobby. But he's got two graves or two tombs in Greyfriars, because he was an atheist. He was kind of buried in the Covenanters graveyard, which is, I think it's still locked actually. You can get the key to go in and have a look at these rebels. But because he was so famous, they then built a separate tomb for him in Greyfriars. But really important. I was so excited to find that connection. And suddenly, oh yeah, well there we go. You know, there's Scotland and the Netherlands really linked together, and linked together in science.
And before we carry on with Boerhaave, you wanted to highlight Yarworth as well, didn't you?
I did, yes. One of my favorite people. William Yarworth, spelt Yworth, but you probably pronounce Yarworth, who was Dutch. And for me, this is one of the first great guides to distillation. It was published in the UK, the beginning of the 18th century. I think the copy I've got, 1705, 1707. It was originally published in the Netherlands. So this is information he brought across with him. He arrived in London in either the late 1680s or 1690s, stayed in London for a while as a doctor or physician. So he was essentially distilling medicines. He was also an alchemist. And part 2 of that book, you showed the frontispiece of the book there. Part 2 of that book is a long list of alchemical and pharmacological recipes. So it's an incredibly important book. You can get kind of reprint copies of it, unless you want to pay about £7,000 for an original. But you know, anytime old distillation gets mentioned, any aspect of it, the history of distillation, that's the first place that I look, and it's amazing how much comes up in there. It's said that I was reading an account of his life and kind of the family tree written by somebody. They're still live. He ended up living around about Ipswich, and the surname was kind of morphed into Walworth. And this kind of family history said he was born in Shipham in the Netherlands. And there is no place called Shipham in the Netherlands. But there is Schiedam, in the Netherlands, and I just wonder if that could be it. Schiedam obviously is, you know, the home of Geneva. Kind of makes sense for a distiller. You know, maybe jumping to conclusions, but it's a nice little link, perhaps. He also collaborated with Isaac Newton, who was also an alchemist. But this book that he wrote goes into distillation in forensic detail. And the introduction to the book, you know, and this, you know, is essentially saying English distillers don't know how to make good spirit. And this book will be the guide to making good quality spirit. And I will explain how to do it. And it starts off by going into great detail about how to set up a distillery. You know, how big your stills are, what brickwork you need. You know, it's like the 1823 Excise Act going, this is how you do it, guys. You know, this is how you're going to be making your spirit. And
he's really angry at London distillers. He thinks they're absolutely useless.
It's about the quality that he finds when he's coming over. You know, it's imprimatic filth, you know, once more. You know, but he has the right way of doing it because he himself then has been trained because, as I think one of the comments said, the Dutch knew how to do it. You know, the Dutch were, you know, alembics on legs, as I think they were once called by the French.
So the Dutch way.
Yeah, so the Dutch way. So there's a lot of talk in the book about, you know, so there's molasses distillation, there's lots of recipes, but the first bit is actually talking about making a malt spirit, which is what is exciting us here. So here is the Dutch way. The third way we call the Dutch way. So here is the Dutch recipe. You know, fermenting of corn, fresh ground malt made of wheat, barley, or buckwheat, separate or together. Not very true. Not very sure here. Put in the oil tubs. It's a long discussion about fermentation. So he talks about fermentation. He talks about long fermentation, about slow fermentation, about not filling your tubs or your wash packs absolutely full. So keeping things cool, keeping things clean. Things which are, you know, any distiller around the world essentially is following this, and we think it's modern and it's not. You know, here's 1705, he's talking about it. You know, never fill your vessels above 3/4 full, and you must leave until fermented and the mixture descends, so the head begins to go, which for the most part will be in the 3rd or 4th day. Okay, the yeast work wasn't so strong, but, you know, allow it, give it time, give it space. Then it is going to be ready for distillation. And here then is your a fairly in-depth description of how to do it. And once again, you know, picked up by Boerhaave, do it slow. Keep the fire nice and slow and steady. Don't rush it. And then again in the next section, which we don't have time to look at, but we will come back to Yarworth in another episode about a different spirit. You know, big on rectification. So it's a long section about rectification, i.e. second distillation, with the inference in there that this was another reason why London spirits or English spirits were so poor. They were distilled once, and you needed to actually have it rectified. And so here's a kind of continuation of fermenting 3 days and then distillation. And then after that, he goes on to the 4th method of distilling malt spirits, the Glauberian way, which is coming from Glauber, who was a Dutch-German scientist, mainly worked with wine. So we're not going to kind of go into any details about Glauber in this one, but I suspect his name may pop up in, once again, future episodes. But yeah, Yarworth, not often discussed, but my God, you know, if you want to find out how spirits were made at the beginning of the 18th century, that's the book to look at.
And where was, so Yarworth was Dutch, you think? Where was Glauber from?
No, he was definitely Dutch. He came across late 1680s, early 1690s. He was in London. He was under where was it? Yeah, he was in above a pub, basically, in London, concocting all his recipes. And he then moved to Norfolk, close to Ipswich. I think perhaps because it was a big community of people coming across from the Low Countries at that particular point, and that's where he ended his life. Well, it sounded like he committed suicide. He didn't. That's where he died, and the family continued there. So yeah,
And Glauber was also Dutch.
Sorry, was Dutch German. So
Dutch German. Yeah, absolutely.
So once again, you see the theme continues. The importance.
Yeah.
Of the Dutch. Yeah.
But there are distilling books that exist, and there are people that write about distilling, and you can pick out this bit and say, well, maybe that influenced it.
Yeah.
But how do we know who read the books? How do we know if they were influenced by those books? What we're going to run through, we're going to go back to Boerhaave now, and we're going to trace that thread of how his influence was felt in Scotland. So the next part comes from some newspaper references. So I'm going to go to the end of that, and then we'll run through the actual article. But if you go right to the very end, this is in 1731. This is collected from the learned Dr. Boerhaave and his new method of chemistry, published in an Edinburgh paper, the Caledonian Mercury, in 1731. Let's run through that. So there's the book itself, and then there's also direct contact, and people who studied under Boerhaave are potentially also influencing this discourse. But this is what is published in the paper. So they talk about a new and exact method of distilling malt spirits, free of the fire, taste, or smell, the hoogoo. Yeah, and we're not going to read the whole lot, but we're just going to pick out a few elements here. So to stop this ill effect, this nasty taste, this smell, oil or grease the bottom or the sides of the still with the sweet butter, or stir it about with a stick, as we now recognize from that, from the earlier Boerhaave recipe, or process, I think is probably a better way to say it rather than recipe. And then the still should not be above 2/3 full. There's this piece of fine linen should be spread over the mouth of the still, which presumably, Dave, they're thinking it's helping to filter out some of this nastiness.
I would suspect so, yeah.
Yeah, but then they go on to say that the fouling is also potentially down to the fact that the liquor itself has not been well fermented. And that's the cause of the disagreeable scent. So well fermented wash is key. And then again, this gentle fire. One drop may justly follow another. And a little bit of instruction about how you manage the fire. And then finally, the rectified spirits may be thus done. Fill your still only half full, so even actually slightly lower than they were saying before, and draw off only 2/3, and effectively make that cut. And this has come from Boerhaave. So that's 1731. So that's great. Then in 1736, same newspaper, 5 years later, what we will see is effectively the same process. Is mentioned. Boerhaave is not credited as such, and a Dr. Preston seems to be the man driving forward the use of this exact process. And here we have the discussion of the Society for Improving in the Knowledge of Agriculture. We'll come on to a bit of discussion about the improvers, which if you've followed our series, you're already familiar with them, and they are, of course, important in Scottish history. I'll summarize it as that. But already they're also motivation, smuggling, trying to stop the influx of Geneva and brandy. That will come up. So again, I'm just going to show, although Boerhaave is not credited, you must oil or grease your still. You must stir it about with a stick. There's this little thing about boiling a bit of water in the still. The still should only be 2/3 full. We want that piece of linen. We also want to make sure that it has been well fermented to avoid this foulness and that disagreeable scent we often smell. And you must distill off spirits with a gentle fire. And they actually say here that first hour, as he said before, keep it at a steady state, but then afterwards you can raise it a little until all the pure spirits are drawn off. And then finally, Dr. Preston, he says, the gentle fire, 2/3 full, it will be free of all scent or taste and as good as spirit drawn from wine. This last point is really interesting. Copies of the above directions will be transferred to the clerks, to the justices of the peace in each county, to be dispersed amongst the country distillers for their improvement. Now, this is different to the received story of Scotch whisky, because we are talking about the improvers in the lowlands, we're talking about the aristocracy, informed by science, suggesting that now we're going to teach the countryside how to distill because they're not making good spirit.
Yeah,
Dave.
Yep. I mean, I absolutely. I think it's a great insight that into what the thinking was. Here's an understanding. Here's a recognized need for spirit and spirit distillation to improve in Scotland. I would say probably the same thing is happening in England, but we're talking about Scotland at the moment. Undoubtedly, and there's a whole number of pressures on this. There's a lot of smuggling going on. There's a lot of kind of rum getting smuggled in. There's a lot of brandy coming in. There's wars, etc., etc. And a lot of what kind of falls into improvement, there's a kind of political agenda. So it's an economic agenda, an agricultural agenda, but it's also a political agenda. So it's a patriotic thing to improve agriculture because you are going to be more self-sufficient as a nation, and therefore, producing your own spirit of a high quality makes a lot of sense. And also, running underneath that means the country will make more tax because the stuff isn't getting smuggled in, but also reading between the lines. Why are people drinking those imported spirits? Is it the allure of the smuggled goods, or is it because they are being recognised as being of higher quality? I would suspect it's because they're recognised as being of higher quality. You look at the drinks recipes, you look at social history, as ever, of what was being consumed at that particular time. It is rum, it is Geneva, it is cognac. So there's a dare I say it, a moral need. There's a political need to actually improve the spirits of Scotland.
But it is interesting that direction of travel, saying we're going to improve the spirit and then we're going to teach the countryside how to make it, was really eye-opening to me. I was just like, what? Because I've always liked that story that the secrets were discovered and possibly Ireland was involved and, and all that kind of stuff. And it was just the lowlands that were mucking things up by making terrible spirit. We'll come on to why that might have been the case later on. But here they're saying this is the way you make good malt whiskey. This is a process for it that scans pretty well. That's all the things that they're suggesting are entirely logical. And we need to teach the countryside. So that was startling to me. And I suppose they could have also discovered to make whiskey in this modernish way, malt whiskey in this modernish way in the Highlands and Islands. But there's no proof for that. There's no evidence for that. We'll probably never find it. But so it could have been a case of independent invention, but they're saying there's a need to teach the Highlands and Islands as well, which is interesting.
Yes.
So, the improvers, I think you're going to take a few moments to describe the improvers again. You've maybe done it already, but here is an advert from 1724. And I think that last line, Dave, that I've highlighted maybe supports what I'm saying a little bit.
Yeah, I think it does. You know, so you've got this idea of the use of foreign spirits, you know, and no duties, etc., etc. You know, members in several districts concur in getting it right and getting right and skillful distillers. You know, I read that and I was thinking, my goodness, you know, this is like, you know, what is happening. You know, in 100 years' time, this is exactly what the landowners are saying to their tenants in on Isle or Speyside or wherever when the Excise Act is passed. You know, we want our good tenants to become good distillers. It's an extraordinary piece that I find it really, really fascinating, and it's great to see it getting pushed. That this date getting pushed right back, and it just makes sense. You know, it makes a huge amount of sense. And you know, who is behind it? You know, who's behind it? Well, who's behind it are the great and the good, or anyway, the great maybe. So it's the landowners. It's by the landowners. And in there, you know, you've highlighted there the Honourable Duncan Forbes of Culloden. So there we have Ferrintosh once again rearing its head. So yeah, I mean, the improvers are really, really fascinating because by the turn of the 17th century, it was fairly obvious that Scotland was lagging really far behind England in terms of agricultural improvement or agricultural production. So in 1723, so the year before that, you know, that Caledonian Mercury piece was written, that the Honourable Society of Improvers for the Knowledge of Agriculture in Scotland was founded, and this was the first in Europe to actually have being essentially a talking shop. It's slightly annoying that there aren't any sort of huge number of documents. You know, I think both of us were expecting, you know, if you go into the National Library of Scotland, there's going to be a wall of books of, you know, about what the improvers were doing. Actually, there's very, very few. We'll come to, you know, essentially the sole reference in a wee while. But it was a talking shop. It was a talking shop, and it was talking about and encouraging better agricultural practice. So that's crop rotation, larger fields, drainage, animal husbandry, and to improve yield, to improve surplus. Population is growing. There is a growing industrial population. Growing, you know, towns are beginning to grow up. So people are, you know, less kind of self-sufficient in terms of living in the countryside. So that the country needed to produce more grain, more vegetables, more meat to feed the people who had moved into town. So machinery begins to be introduced, etc. This is all kind of, you know, encapsulated within this move for improvements. It does go sour, which is what the whole clearance idea was. Clearance episode was all about. But you know, here it is sound practice. You know, when it is set up, and it is the landowners. And I think one of the ones that I think intrigues me the most, and again, it's a name which seems to have really fallen off. Certainly, whiskey history. It might not have fallen. I'm not a great agricultural historian. I'm not an agricultural historian at all. I'm not even a historian. But you know, certainly in terms of Scotch whisky history, the name of Sir John Cockburn of Ormiston is not really mentioned. I think that's a portrait of him when he was pretty young. But anyway,
some roof on him. Look at that roof on him.
You know, it's an incredible head of hair he's got. But he was known as the father of Scottish husbandry. And Ormiston is in Lothian. He inherited the estate from his father. He then gave long leases to his tenants. He lowered the rent, so he allowed them to kind of stay on the land, encouraged them to use improved agricultural practices. He brought up consultants from England and elsewhere. He sent some of the sons of his tenants down to learn practically ways to improve agriculture, mixed crops, crop rotation, etc., etc. And one of his tenants is a man called Alexander White. And Alexander White, it is claimed, was the first man in Britain to sow turnips in drills and then cultivate them with the plough. And in 1735, a turnip, which he had grown weighing 34 3/4 pounds, was carried in due ceremony into Edinburgh and hung up on display in John's Coffee House. That's great. So well done, Alexander White, and well done, John Cockburn, champion turnip growers. But
what a time to be alive in John's
Yeah.
Coffee House. Wow.
Oh, have you seen the neep? It's great. There was crowds flocking through Edinburgh to see the giant neep from Ormiston. Ormiston, the other thing about Ormiston is it's the first planned village in Scotland. We've talked a lot about planned villages, especially when we talk about whiskey history. The planned villages that grew up in Speyside. Dufton would be one example. Keith would be another. Ormiston was the first. And this is also where Cockburn's genius comes in, because people are they've moved off the land, but there's now employment in the small town. There's linen manufacture going on, there's blacksmithing, there's candle makers. And in 1726, White, the turnip grower, was encouraged to set up a maltings, a brewery, and a distillery. And the distillery then became quite famous. More grain was grown in the area, and other distilleries sprung up. So there was one in North Berwick by Mr. Swinton, one in Innerwick, Thorntonloch, Linton Bridge Distillery, which might be relatively close to you, Arthur. St. Clemens Wells Distillery, where the troops had to march on and people got killed. Ian Russell, thank you for passing that information on. Boggs Distillery in Ormiston, West Burns Distillery. This is a bit later, 1796. But all these distilleries, 1720s, all the way through the 18th century, you're seeing these distilleries starting up in these areas, in improved areas, following good practice. And it really is a story that's not been told, I think.
And who should Cockburn turn to find that good practice?
Arthur.
No, it wasn't me. He brought over artisans from Holland to instruct his people at Ormiston. I think there's a good chance it could be our friend Henricus van Wyngarden.
Yep.
We'll come on to that in a bit. So, shall we look at the 1743 transactions of the Honourable Society of Improvers?
I think we should. Yes.
Yeah, it's as you said, there's not that much, because I think they met up and had a chat more than anything. But these transactions, I think, have got just some great stuff in there, and it brings back in our fellow Henricus van Wyngarden. So, as I said, Henricus has been referred to absolutely in the past. In recent writing, I'll come on to that. But within these transactions, they refer to Mr. Henricus van Wyngarden, who came from Holland 12 or 14 years ago, settled at Edinburgh, and followed the distilling business with success and a fair character, which helped to spirit up most of the distillers we now have to follow that business. And he was pleased to furnish the society with the material parts of these answers. So there's a great question and answer session that comes on in a moment. But we're all about finding sources that lead us in ways to do different research. And actually, this whole episode really comes from me buying this journal 5 years ago, probably, the Chambers Journal. And it mentioned Henricus van Wyngarden and these transactions of the improvers, and this text about distilling business for success and fair character. And I wasn't aware of the importance of Dutch distillers in the history of gin, rum, cognac. And I certainly wasn't aware of their significance in the history of whiskey. So it kind of always intrigued me, and I was always looking out for things. And eventually, well, last year, really, we started to make a bit of a breakthrough to tie these things up. In fact, I pulled it off the shelf. There it is. But interestingly, if we look at the historiography, I think that's the word. It's one of those stories that keeps popping up. Chambers, what was the year of that one? 1871. There's another one in 1873 in the Daily Review. It's the Dumfries and Galloway Standard quoting the Daily Review saying, the original instructor of our Scotch distillers was a Dutchman. And then in the Daily Record, again, so the modern development of Scotch shows something to the Dutch. So it keeps kind of getting repeated over time. And a few people have done a little bit of work on it more recently. Tice, I think that's how his name, Tice Cleverstein. He wrote a really good article on his blog. I'm not sure if anybody's going right into these transactions and analysing them, and certainly not drawing that link to Boerhaave. So I'm not claiming we have discovered Henricus van Wyngarden, but we're going into a bit more detail of him. And I've gone as far as I can to give a bit of colour of the man. These are some beautiful pieces of paper that I found in the National Records of Scotland. And I actually knew they were there since COVID lockdown, but you couldn't get in that place for a long time afterwards. And I've had a bit more time recently. And by God, do these letters take time to gently unpick and then try and read this 18th century scrawl. These are just a few of them, and I probably looked at 5 groups of records, I think it was. There was nothing particularly revelatory, I would say, that cracked the code of distilling, because they were they were mostly legal letters back and forth. So what do we know about Henricus van Wyngarden? So he probably came over to Scotland in the late 20s, I think. He was living in the grass market, I think, in maybe the 40s, something along those lines. And he kept getting into arguments and legal disputes with people. And he also had a brother in Rotterdam, Johan. And in that relationship, there was a number of transactions that went wrong. So I think he probably leaves in 1751, because one of the legal disputes was his landlord, Sir Walter Montgomery. And basically it said he owes a year's worth of rent, and they were going to sell his furniture, and they were saying how much his furniture was worth. He was also involved in deals with his brother in Rotterdam, exporting things like cognac, Bordeaux, and then in 1746, a young bull. So Sir John Dalrymple, which I have just realised by chance, where are they? Yeah, that's where he met him.
He's there.
Although no, it's maybe a little bit earlier than that. So anyway, he was one of the improvers. Sir John Dalrymple. A couple of Dalrymples
in there. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it could well have been him. So Sir John Dalrymple asked him to get him a young Dutch bull. So he got his brother to find him a young Dutch bull, and they paid a large amount of money for this young Dutch bull, put it on a ship to ship it over to Scotland. And when it arrived in Scotland, the bull was dead. And there's this back and forth of these letters, these legal letters, with Sir John Dalrymple's writer, his lawyer, saying, "I'm not paying for a dead bull." And I can understand that. And Henricus said, "Well, we put it on the ship. We gave it loads of we gave it lots of straw and hay and lots of linseed cakes for it to eat. And it's surely the fault of the captain that I think they kept it on deck rather than giving it a nice place. And anyway, the bull died." I couldn't quite work out what the conclusion of it was, but there were at least two or three back and forth. Well, no, exactly. And he got in an argument with some fencers from a fencing company from Musselburgh as well, who ordered a load of Bordeaux. And So he's litigious, or these deals keep going wrong, and that's who he is. But what we do know, he seems to be some kind of consultant to a new Scotch whisky industry of legal distillers that are coming on stream in the late 20s and the 30s. And years later, he is remembered as doing a good job.
Yep, the Jim Swan of his day.
And those distilleries, as you say, really aren't mentioned much in the big histories of whiskey.
Yeah. Everything, it was like you were saying earlier, Arthur. Our attention goes immediately north. But when you're talking about it, the history of whiskey production in the lowlands essentially is talking about grain, about the growth of grain whiskey, and I think kind of digging into what Cockburn was doing and digging into the remarkable number of distilleries that sprang up in East Lothian, I think is worthy of more research, and it does. I don't know if it utterly changes our story of Scotch whisky, but I think it makes it richer. I think it adds other layers, and makes it. And I think what the exciting thing is, it doesn't simplify. It actually makes it more complex, because there are all these different pressures working within Scotland at the time: social pressures, economic pressures, religious pressures, etc., which help to craft and move the nature of Scotch whisky in various different ways. It's not just this kind of clean, linear story. It's a messy one, it's a naughty one, and that's KNOTTY.
I'm excited by that.
Yeah. But
I'm excited by that complexity. I think there's probably a few brand ambassadors and people who have to present the history of Scotch whisky in the first 5 minutes of a tasting that are probably not excited by the fact that it's because we're making it more complex. But let's move on to what Henricus is doing for the improvers and in these transactions. So again, I've highlighted some key parts. All these slides, if we're going too quickly, you can watch on the rerun, you can pause it, you can read them in detail. But so again, our country drained of its specie to procure these foreign spirits. So French, Dutch spirits, we're getting very, very familiar from that. He also interestingly talks about the destructive trade of smuggling. And this is a Mr. Groat of Was up in Caithness, and says how in Caithness and Orkney, especially Orkney, smuggling is absolutely rife. But he's saying distilling is not at all well understood with us. And I want you to take the trouble to show them to such persons who you think can understand those things best. And show what? Sorry, ask the best person, write it down, and then show people he need to know, because the subtext is, we're not really sure what we're doing. Yeah. So Mr. Groat has a number of queries, and the improvers ask the one man who really knows, well, maybe not the one man, but the accepted expert, in inverted commas, Van Wyngarden. Before we go into these queries, Mr. Groat of Was in Caithness. Dave.
Yeah, I did a little bit of digging. Who is Mr. Groat of Wars? Where was Wars? As you said, it's in Caithness. So I did a wee bit of digging about the Groats of Wars, and it's possibly Malcolm Groat. It might be his son Donald, but I think it's more likely to be Malcolm Groat, because he was the last of the Groats of Wars. He died, or I think he was bankrupted. So maybe this is the last flaring. He wants to kind of make some money in distilling. And then I kind of did a little bit digging about with the family tree. And it turns out that Malcolm Groat was an ancestor of John of Groat, Jan de Groot, best known as John O'Groats.
An ancestor or a descendant?
Descendant.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
A descendant of Jan de Groot, John O'Groats. And Jan de Groot was Dutch.
They're bloody everywhere.
They're everywhere. Oh, I couldn't believe it. I was going, oh my God, I was thinking Mr. Groat, what a funny name. And then you thought, hang on, Case Ness, Yeah, and there it is. So anyway, Mr. Groat, Malcolm, let's say it's Malcolm Groat. Malcolm Groat is searching around to find the best way to make whiskey because he's a bit stumped. And that's what I love about this particular book, is that, there's just this one section about distillation, but it is a question and answer thing. What should I grow? What beans should I plant, etc. It's an amazing piece. But anyway, let's have a look at Mr. Groat and his problems.
Yeah. So again, as I say, it would take us another hour to go through them in detail. It's really, really interesting. Go back to it, pause it, look at the other ones. But yeah, I've done that introduction. So queries 1 to 5. I think there's 17 queries in total. Yeah. We've highlighted the ones that most interested you, Dave, and gives that kind of flavor of the problems, yeah, and a tone and confidence with which Henricus answers them.
Yeah. Dave. So questions on the left-hand side, answers from Henricus on the right. Should hops be put in worts used for distillation? No. Fine. Okay. Next, number 4. How long should the liquors be fermented and acquire some tartness or acidity before they be committed to distill? And Henricus replies, fermentation should be allowed to continue until it is fully perfected. And when it's fermented, as directed, let the sweetness go off. So it's going to become a little bit acidic, and you may allow it to grow a little hard. Again, that more kind of bite to it before you begin to distill. But don't let it go too far, otherwise it'll end up with vinegar. We're almost back to what Yarworth was writing there. So gentle, longer, controlled fermentation is important. And then number 5, I want to know if the barm or flowers, that's yeast, should be put along with the fermenting wash. I want to know if the lees and bottoms might be mixed up with the liquor and thrown into the still together. Put the barm and lees into the still along with the liquor, but if the lees be thick, put likewise in water or rather faints to make them thinner. So dilute them. It's not a thick mash. You're going to have problems if you're distilling a thick mash. Thank you, Henricus. Then we move on. I picked out number 8 here. Is it not a great fault among distillers to allow any of the faints to run among their pure goods? And there we have, for a trial, allow the low wines to run while they'll take fire from a candle and burn on the still head. It's an old way of testing. What comes after is to go to faints in the next distillation among the low wines. So we've got double distillation taking place and also a measuring of when to make your cut. And then number 1, should I distill the faints separately? No, they're never to be distilled by themselves. They might be added back if you've got a thick mash, but don't distill them by themselves. You get when I'm reading this, I could the answers tend to get slightly shorter and more abrupt. It's just like, oh God, you numpty, you haven't a clue.
What are you doing? What are you doing? You feel
Mr. Groat. Should I add hops? No, for God's sake. Idiot. And then number 12. Should I add water? Etc. The observation on this is so small. Observe through all the parts of your distillation that the spirits run perfectly cool and flow through the worm. Otherwise, they will be blue. Blue in color. Slow distillation. You're not wanting, if you're distilling too hard, you're going to get some faintiness coming through. Your spirit's going to be dark. So this is proper distillation, proper distilling practice being applied at this point by Henricus. Even though he is getting slightly peevish and perhaps even litigious at this particular point. Don't mention the bull. Mr. Groat, do not mention the bull. And then...
do not meddle. You must not meddle. It's like, it all seems so basic to him. But
And then
We're not actually going to highlight any of these,
No.
but I'm just going to leave it on the screen for a few seconds. So if people are watching on the replay, they can pause it and do that.
Yeah,
Although it is interesting that he says they don't put in salt.
There's a lot of this DOAD Glauber salt, which is sodium chloride, which was practiced, but that was the Glauber method. The Dutch method didn't add salt, so he's sticking to the classic Dutch method. You even see that in 15. This is not used in Holland. Some do it here.
So query is 16 to 17.
Yeah, so 16. This is about how to deal with off notes. So there was quite a lot of discussion in the last one about maturation as being used to get rid of hogo, which comes from the French au goût, high smell, hogo, goût, etc., etc. So how, and essentially it's the product of a faulty and probably bacterial infection, perhaps in your fermentation. It's bad distillation, so your spirit's going to be stinky. One of the practices, and I think some people mentioned it in the comments from last week, how do you get rid of the goo? Well, you take the bung holes out of the cask or whatever receiving vessel you had, and hopefully it just kind of evaporates off and mellows in that particular way. So Mr. Groat is asking that. And Henricus goes, well, if these directions, if you've paid attention, pal, if these directions be exactly observed, your spirits are going to be fine. But if you have foul spirits occasioned by unclean casks, there you go. It's the lack of hygiene. Take the whites of 8 eggs in a hogshead of spirits and a spoonful of common salt. So you're kind of talking about a filtration system going on here, like a fining system.
Fining.
We don't approve of leaving the bung holes open. So unless it's for a very short time. So again, no, don't follow that. I don't know who told you that, but don't do it. I don't know who Mr. Groat, I don't know what book Mr. Groat has been reading, but essentially, I feel sorry for him, but by the end of this, he's asking all of these questions, and essentially everything, pretty much everything he's asked, Van Wyngarden has gone, no.
Yeah, there's almost, if people go back and spend a bit of time to read them, and sorry, it's a bit scattered, but they're actually, the questions are in one part of the document, then the answers in another part of the document. So I had to get them side by side on the screen to go a bit of time there. But he's almost, at points he's almost trying to impress with like, and I've tried doing this and I've heard this, and he's trying to impress him, and that Van Wyngarden's like, no.
I've got another one.
So anyway, it's a great document, and you say what books has he been reading or who has he been copying? And this is in a remote part of Scotland. Maybe who's he been copying? And this comes back to this kind of theory that in the wilds of Scotland they had perfected distillation, and that's who we learnt from. Well, Was is right up there in the wilds of Scotland, and he's making crap and doesn't know why he's making crap. And he needs this Dutchman who's been working in the lowlands and some time before has taught people how to make what looks like to us pretty decent malt whiskey. So it does throw that story in its head. So, I mean, I think we should come on to talk about why this little chapter has been forgotten of what might have happened in a moment. But before we do that, maybe a little recapping conclusion. And as I've put this research together and put these slides together, I think what this stuff has showed is as follows. Dave, you can let me know if you agree with this. So we've got Boerhaave defining a process of malt distillation that maps fairly closely what we think of as decent malt whiskey. It will be a decent spirit. He's been working on that, teaching it, and has written it down in the 30s with obvious links to Edinburgh. We've got a Dutch consultant setting up numerous distilleries. I mean, that word consultant is a modern word. But anyway, he was employed to set up numerous distilleries in the late 20s and 30s. Then we've got a very similar recipe / process shared in Scottish newspapers by influential people, and Boerhaave originally credited, and actually saying we need to take this recipe to the countryside. And actually there's that going through the justices of the peace. And so from influential landowners, they own the land Scotland is on, they control it and are actively trying to improve agriculture at this time. They're the ones who are saying, and through the network of justices of the peace, show people how to make decent malt whiskey. And then a decade later, or not quite a decade later, they're still asking this Dutch consultant for advice. That is a really crucial role in the spread of expertise and quality control towards what we know as malt whiskey. And therefore, in conjunction with maturing it, so it tastes more like what we would consider to be malt whiskey, which is an aged spirit made a certain way into certain quality standards. This is a key impact. But the 18th century doesn't work out like that, does it, Dave?
Well, no, because all of this is certainly it's set up. Here we've got all of this taking place beginning of the 18th century. We're going up to about the 1840s, and you're seeing the beginnings of deliberate conscious maturation taking place. You're seeing better quality distillation practices getting introduced, new distilleries opening up. And then it stops. And it's kind of why the gap. We talked about this last week. Why the gap? There seems to be this gap. And I think this is one reason why people then pick up on what happened in from 1816, 1823 Act, etc. It's because there's this kind of nothing has happened. We haven't looked far enough back, but nothing has happened. So why did it stop? Why didn't this become standard practice across Scotland? And there's a whole reason for doing this. Going back to Cockburn of Ormiston, he was bankrupted in 1748. He had to sell his estate to the Earl of Hopetoun because he'd spent so much money on improvements and building the town and all the kind of good works that he did. It bankrupted him, so it was an expensive business to start getting into. Again, this is something we see in the 1820s. And then what also happens in the 18th century in that particular part of Scotland, coal. So you begin to see mining. So the Earls of Hopetoun turned their back on agriculture and went into mining. So you see all of that then beginning to disappear. So that kind of Lothian experiment, if you want to call it, I would say begins to founder. But then, as ever, you've got to look wider in terms of what else is happening in the country. You're talking about the 1740s. What happens in 1745? You've got the Jacobite uprising. You've got civil war taking place. You've got conflict. You've got disturbance. You've got punitive measures by England. You've got all of this chaos going on. And even once that begins to die down, what else are we talking about in terms of drink? We're talking about gin craze. We're talking about increasingly ridiculous, punitive tax acts getting brought in to try and control gin consumption or whiskey distillation or whatever. All of this is going to affect what was, I think, assumed to be the lovely natural progression of a high quality malt spirit. And as a result of that, once you then shift your focus back to the lowlands and look at what didn't happen there, which is continuation of Cockburn and improvers and malt whiskey, you see the great gin, you see the great grain distillers, because of legislation, turning to the flat bottom stills and making bad quality grain spirit. So all of these things are kind of moving around. So this idea that there should have been this natural, maybe not trouble-free, but a natural kind of progression and an earlier understanding of a modern Scotch whisky industry really developing in the 18th century, it is then halted or stalled until the beginning of the 19th as a result. For me, it was a completely new way of looking at. I've always kind of castigated those grain distillers as just being lazy, and but they weren't. They were trying to make a buck. The Haigs were trying to make a buck. We need to talk about the Haigs, by the way. The Haigs were just trying to make a buck, and they couldn't. And the only way they could do it was actually, ironically, by making crappy spirit, which would then be sent to England to be rectified into gin. But all these different pressures. Whiskey does not exist on its own.
Well, quickly, go on then. Talk about the Haigs.
Oh yeah,
we can't do another chapter.
yeah. No, it was a very quick one, because I suddenly realised we hadn't actually talked about, why the Dutch. Why is everybody talking about the Dutch? And I think there's a question really quite early on about distillers going over to the Netherlands to study, and Netherlands and Belgium to study about distillation. It's because the Dutch were the repository, and they understood not just the art of distillation, but the practical application of distillation. And if you look at the three great spirits of the 17th and the 18th century, you have cognac, you have rum, and you have Geneva. These are the quality standards. Cognac. So cognac essentially starts early 17th century. By 1720s, the Dutch are buying 50% of the cognac, either for fortification or for their fleet or for redistillation. Brandy is a Dutch term. The technology, still design, in fact, stills themselves were coming from Holland. So the approach was Dutch. In rum, the first distillers in Barbados were Dutch distillers or Dutch sugar planters who had been kicked out of what is now Brazil or Guyana when the Portuguese began to move north. Also in Martinique, so the first distillers there. The Dutch introduced windmills to Barbados to help crush the cane. And if you look at the story of molasses distillation, both in the Caribbean and in Europe, again, it's the Dutch behind it. And then, obviously, Geneva itself. And let's not forget that Geneva essentially is aromatized whiskey. So is there any surprise that the Dutch were called on to help the Scotch whisky industry? They were making whiskey. They were just adding juniper to it. And, because I mentioned the Haigs, 1640s, there are accounts of the Haigs either visiting relatives or going on a fact-finding mission to Schiedam, to the Netherlands, to learn how to make Geneva. So that's why the Dutch. Nobody else had a mastery of distillation like they did.
Which comes back to the point, it's not really a surprise. We just hadn't been able to find a really secure link to kind of how it happened.
Yeah.
Which I feel pretty good about what we've done tonight and the research over the last year or so. But I think it maybe leads to just changing this kind of countryside learning how to make great malt whiskey. I think what could well have happened, and what I think this evidence showed, is it came from Holland with people like Boerhaave, like Henricus van Wyngarden. They spread that to the countryside. Then the lowlands were kind of forced into this situation, economic, political, tax regime, into making utter rubbish. And in the Highlands and Islands, they continued to use this good Dutch process, improve the quality of their spirit, beat the lowland distillers on that quality point, and then there became this assumption in the stories of history that they had come up with it themselves. But there seems to be a pretty clear through line from Holland to me.
Yeah. No, I like that idea. I think, you know, it's, yeah. I mean, it kind of backs up this kind of two styles of whiskey always being made in Scotland, but just in a completely different way. It used to be, well, it was only grain down here and malt up there, and et cetera, et cetera. But actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. But it does, yeah. As I said earlier, it just adds another layer of interest and complication to the whole story, which thrills me.
We done?
I think so.
Yeah,
That was good. I enjoyed that.
yeah.
I hope everybody
absolutely.
else enjoyed it. You know,
Yeah.
it was nice talking to you, Arthur. You know,
It always is. It always is, Dave. Yeah, that's a great pleasure, and it's it's great to be able to share the research finally. So, thanks very much, Dave.
You've been working very hard on this for a long time. And I remember that first phone call. You're going, "Oh, you'll never guess what I found. Have you heard of this man?" And it's, yeah, I mean, this is why we do this stuff, folks, you know, because it excites us, and because we think it just helps move the discussion along. And I think making things more complicated and more complex just allows you more avenues to explore. You know, this kind of simplistic, rather, you know, binary, dualistic idea of what whiskey is and what whiskey isn't. I think, you know, let's get rid of this, because, you know, the mess of history is far more interesting.
Absolutely, and most of our episodes comes with follow-ups from people in the week afterwards, and we've now got Patreon there. And I'm sure some questions will come in there. I'll also review the comments of this episode and the previous episode as well. And I think we'll probably have a discussion over on Patreon and answer some of those questions, and maybe get a few more people on screen as a follow-up. But once again, thank you to everyone for watching. Thank you for our patrons as well. It's really driving us forward. And we're probably a few weeks away from the next episode, but not too far, I think, Dave, where we're going to move on to a different spirit, aren't we? I think.
Move on to a different spirit, but pick up on a couple of folk we've mentioned tonight. So I think there's a nice little, link. There's a nice linkage going on.
Great. Night, Dave.
Night, Arthur. Night, everyone.
Night, yeah, cheerio. Goodbye.